It was the fall of 1994 when the Nelson family moved to a remote town in North Carolina. The transfer was sudden, and with limited time to prepare, the family barely had a week to uproot their lives and move. John Nelson, the head of the family and a state police officer, had been reassigned to this quiet town. His wife, Margaret, was 5 months pregnant, and the stress of the move weighed heavily on her. Alongside them were their 2 children, 13-year-old Emily and 7-year-old Sam, as well as John's younger brother, Henry. By the time they arrived at their new destination, the clock had struck 9 p.m. Exhausted from the journey, they found that the government quarters assigned to them weren't ready yet. Instead, they were temporarily placed in an old, decrepit house on the outskirts of town. The house stood on uneven ground, surrounded by towering oak trees. It had no electricity, and its bamboo and mud structure looked more like an abandoned relic than a home. But fatigue outweighed apprehension, and they had no choice but to settle in for the night. The first night, the family quickly set up makeshift beds and fell asleep. Around 2 a.m., Margaret woke up feeling uneasy. She needed to use the restroom, but it was located outside the house. Hesitant, she tried waking Henry to accompany her, but he was a sound sleeper. Mustering her courage, Margaret stepped outside into the cool night. The moon cast an eerie glow over the property, and the silhouette of a gnarled oak tree loomed ominously over the outdoor restroom. As she hurried back to the house, she felt a sudden, intense warmth enveloping her, making her uncomfortable. Brushing it off as her pregnancy playing tricks on her, she returned to bed. Moments later, a loud thud echoed from outside, jolting her awake again. Alarmed, she shook John awake. He dismissed her concerns, attributing the noise to a stray animal. But 10 minutes later, the sound returned, louder and more startling. This time, everyone in the house was awake. John bolted upright. He rushed to check the window, but there was no one there. Yet the sound had been so clear, so deliberate. The figure in the window. Unable to sleep, Margaret lay awake, her eyes fixed on the window. The dim moonlight seeped through the thin curtains, casting long shadows across the room. Suddenly, a movement outside caught her eye. A shadowy figure with elongated hands pressed against the windowpane. Margaret's breath hitched as the figure's face came into view. It was a woman, but her face was grotesque, distorted, and smeared with blood. The figure's eyes seemed to pierce into Margaret's soul. Margaret tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. She felt an invisible force tightening around her neck, choking the air out of her. Struggling against the suffocation, she thrashed wildly, waking John, who immediately noticed her distress. He shook her awake, breaking the spell. The unfolding nightmare. The next day, the family discussed the events of the night. Margaret was visibly shaken, but John tried to downplay the situation, chalking it up to exhaustion and stress. However, that night, the terror escalated. As the family slept, a chilling wind blew through the house, extinguishing their oil lamps. Emily was the first to wake, hearing faint whispers near her bed. The whispers grew louder, taking on a guttural tone. When she opened her eyes, she saw a pair of bloodshot eyes staring at her from the corner of the room. Her scream woke everyone, but as John rushed to her side, the figure vanished, leaving behind the scent of decayed flowers. A haunting past. Desperate for answers, Margaret spoke to a neighbor about the house. She learned that it had once belonged to a policewoman who had mysteriously disappeared. A few weeks later, her body was found in the house, her wrists slit and her face mutilated. Some said it was a murder staged as a suicide. Others believed she had been cursed. The neighbor added, "They say pregnant women attract her. She's searching for something, or someone." The final confrontation. On their last night in the house, Margaret decided to stay awake and confront whatever had been tormenting them. As midnight struck, the house grew unnaturally cold. The windows rattled, and the whispers returned, this time louder than ever. The shadowy figure appeared once more, this time inside the room. Margaret stood her ground, clutching a rosary she had found in a drawer. The figure lunged at her, but as Margaret began to pray, the entity recoiled, letting out a piercing scream before vanishing into thin air. A new beginning. The family moved into their permanent quarters the next day. Though the new house was peaceful, the memory of the shadowy figure haunted them for years. Margaret never forgot the terror of that week, nor did she ever doubt the presence of the supernatural. As for the old house, it remained abandoned, its haunting secrets sealed within its walls, waiting, perhaps, for the next unsuspecting visitor. Now, second story pizza delivery. It was Thursday evening when I completed my last delivery of the shift. Work was overwhelming because another delivery guy had stopped answering calls and coming to work for weeks, so the rest of us were doing overtime. The address I was given was a house located on the outskirts of the city. The place was so secluded and far from any crowd that it seemed as if it could swallow even the faintest light. My name is Jack, and this is the night when the incident happened to me. The night started strangely. A large pizza with no toppings, the option to pay at the time of delivery, and a note asking to place the pizza on the dining table. I was curious, but I had seen many odd requests in this job. As soon as my bike turned onto the gravel road, I started feeling uneasy. Something is wrong, I told myself while checking the GPS again, but the location was correct. As I carried the pizza box to the main door, the wind turned cold. I knocked, hoping no one would answer, and that's exactly what happened. No one came to the door, so I turned the knob and the door opened. "Hello!" My voice echoed into the darkness inside. "Pizza delivery?" No response. The inside of the house was enveloped in shadows. Dust particles floated in the air. The open windows had broken frames, and strange paintings hung on the walls. As I walked into what I guessed was the dining room, my footsteps echoed on the wooden floor. There was the table as mentioned in the note, but it wasn't empty. A fine set of dinnerware, covered in thick dust, was arranged neatly. Even the entire table was shrouded in a thick layer of dust, except for one spot, a clean pizza box-sized space. I placed the box there. "This is too strange," I said aloud and decided to leave. That's when I heard it. A faint sound of a chair sliding behind me. I turned quickly, but no one was there. My heart began to race. I turned back to leave, but then I froze. The paintings on the wall had changed. Where there were once images of mountains, rivers, and strange abstract patterns, now there were portraits of people smiling. But their smiles were hollow, and their eyes were empty voids. Fear started to grip me. I rushed to the door, but it wouldn't open. "Why won't it open?" I gasped, my breath visible in the suddenly cold air. I turned back toward the room, and that's when I heard it. A faint whispering sound. It wasn't just one voice, but many, whispering in unison. And then, suddenly, a woman's voice whispered in my ear, "The food must be finished." I tried to cover my ears, but the voice was already etched into my mind. The temperature dropped even further. As I exhaled, I saw my breath fogging up the air. Then I heard laughter, soft, sinister, childlike laughter, hiding something malevolent. Shadows danced on the walls, forming shapes that seemed human but weren't entirely human. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the cold wood of the dining table. And then I saw it. The pizza box was open, but inside was no pizza. Instead, there was a grotesque piece of flesh emitting a putrid stench. It wasn't just rotten meat. It was something far worse. I covered my mouth to stop myself from retching. "Please let me go," I pleaded to no one in particular. The whispers from the woman grew louder. The child's laughter intensified. Then a painting fell off the wall, shaking the entire room. The painting depicted a man, a woman, and a little girl, all without eyes. The temperature suddenly returned to normal. The shadows receded, and the laughter vanished into the air. I was alone, or so I thought, until I saw her. Standing at the threshold of the dining room was a little girl, no older than 7, with hollow, empty sockets where her eyes should have been. "Would you like to have dinner with us?" she asked, her voice a mix of innocence and dark depth. I couldn't speak or move. Her eyeless gaze felt like it was pulling the very essence out of me. "I can't," I stammered. "I need to leave." "But you're our guest," she said, twisting her head completely around until her face was now on her back. "And the food isn't finished yet." As she spoke, the air grew heavier, filled with a tension so suffocating that the room itself seemed to darken. Summoning all my courage, I said, "I'm not from this place." The girl smiled, a smile that was both innocent and deceptive. "No one is, until they come here," she replied enigmatically before disappearing into the darkness. Panic surged through me as I looked for a way out. The eyes in the paintings followed me wherever I went, watching my every move. I felt like a trapped mouse in a maze, at the mercy of forces beyond my understanding. Desperately, I threw myself at the window, hoping to escape, but instead of shattering, it felt like hitting a solid wall. My shoulder throbbed in pain as I realized I was just a pawn in the house's game. Suddenly, the house began to show its true, horrifying nature. The ground beneath me shook, and a woman's scream echoed through the house. I finally saw a figure behind the little girl. A large man, covered in blood-stained clothes, sitting silently and staring at me with his hollow sockets. "Come have dinner with us," the little girl repeated. Terrified, I gave in. I slowly walked to the dining table, picked up a piece of the meat, and, with trembling hands, took a bite. I closed my eyes, bracing for the taste of decay, but instead, it tasted like bread. When I opened my eyes, I found myself back in the dusty, lifeless room. The eyeless entities were gone, the woman's scream had ceased, and I was alone, eating the same pizza I had delivered. Silence enveloped me. A new sound shattered the stillness, the ringing of my phone. The sharp tone was jarring. My hands shook as I answered. "Hello," I said weakly. "Jack." "It's me," my manager said from the other end. "Why are you taking so long? You've been out for 2 hours." 2 hours? I muttered in disbelief. Felt like I'd only been in the house for a few minutes. "I'm trapped. Please help me," pleaded. "What house? What are you talking about?" my manager asked, confused. I looked around for something, anything that could ground me in reality. That's when I noticed the pizza box on the table. It was empty. The entire pizza was gone. "Who ate it?" I thought. My manager's voice grew more concerned. "Jack, listen. Why does the order in the system show it was placed in your name? From your number." My heart sank. Trembling, I checked the order details, and my hands went numb. It was true. The order was placed under my name. I ran out of the house as fast as I could, and that's when I met the delivery boy who had stopped coming to work. He told me he had experienced something similar in that house. The incident only ended when he ate the pizza he delivered. The pizza place immediately updated its system to blacklist that address. No delivery person ever went back to that house. Even though the house was blacklisted, I couldn't shake off the memory of that night. The incident stayed with me, haunting my dreams and clouding my thoughts during the day. The little girl's hollow gaze and the enigmatic smile haunted my nights, and I found myself jolting awake, drenched in cold sweat. Days turned into weeks, but the sense of unease never left me. I had stopped delivering pizzas altogether, finding a desk job instead. Yet, no matter how much I tried to distance myself, strange occurrences began following me. It started subtly. My phone would ring at odd hours, displaying no caller ID. When I answered, I would hear faint whispers, indecipherable yet chilling. Then there were the shadows. They would appear in the corners of my vision, shifting unnaturally, always there but never fully visible. My coworkers began to notice my exhaustion and paranoia, but I couldn't explain it to them without sounding insane. One night, as I sat alone in my apartment, scrolling through the channels on my television, the screen abruptly turned to static. Before I could switch it off, an image flickered on the screen. It was the same dining table from that house. The pizza box was there, and so were the empty chairs. But now there were 3 plates served with food, one of them holding a slice of pizza. I froze in fear. Then the image changed. The little girl appeared on the screen. Her eyeless sockets stared directly at me, as if she could see me through the screen. "You didn't finish your meal," she said, her voice distorted and echoing. The lights in my apartment flickered, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I turned off the television and grabbed my car keys, deciding to leave the apartment and drive anywhere far away. As I stepped out, the streetlights outside began to dim one by one, leaving me in near total darkness. Suddenly, a child's laughter echoed through the empty street. I spun around, but no one was there. My heart pounded as I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys to unlock the door. Once inside, I locked the doors and started the engine, determined to get as far away as possible. The moment I pulled onto the road, the car's radio turned on by itself. Static filled the speakers, and then I heard the woman's voice again. "You must come back," she whispered. "No," I yelled, slamming my hands on the steering wheel. "Leave me alone." The road ahead seemed endless, the city's lights disappearing behind me. It was as if I was driving into a void. My surroundings became unfamiliar, and I realized I was no longer on any road I recognized. The trees lining the street loomed ominously, their branches twisting unnaturally. Out of nowhere, the car came to a screeching halt. The engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded in the middle of the dark, eerie road. I tried restarting it, but the car wouldn't respond. That's when I noticed the figure standing in the distance. It was her, the little girl. She stood motionless, her head tilted slightly to one side, as if curiously observing me. Behind her, the shadowy figure of the man emerged, his hulking frame and blood-stained clothes as terrifying as I remembered. "You can't run," the little girl said, her voice resonating in my ears even though she was far away. "We're family now. Come back and finish what you started." I screamed, overwhelmed with fear and desperation. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment, sitting on my couch. My television was off, and the room was eerily silent. For a brief moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare, until I noticed the empty pizza box sitting on the coffee table in front of me. I don't know how it got there. I don't know how I got back to my apartment. But the one thing I do know is that I'm not free. Not yet. Every time I close my eyes, I see the house. I hear the whispers, and I know that someday they'll come back for me. In the weeks that followed, my life unraveled. No matter how far I went, how hard I tried to forget, the shadow of that cursed house loomed over me. It wasn't just the memories. It was something alive, something persistent, gnawing at the edges of my reality. Strange things began to escalate. Objects in my apartment moved on their own. My bedroom door, which I always kept closed, would be ajar when I woke up. Once, I found muddy footprints leading from the front door to my bed, small, childlike prints. The whispers grew louder, more coherent. "Come back," they pleaded. "We miss you." And every time I ignored them, the occurrences worsened. A glass shattered in my hand one day, its shards cutting deep into my palm. My reflection in the mirror would twist, smiling back at me even when I wasn't smiling. I decided to seek help, desperate for answers. A friend recommended a local priest known for his work in exorcisms and paranormal cleansings. Father O'Brien was skeptical at first, but as I recounted the events, his expression darkened. "You've crossed into something far older than ghosts," he said gravely. "The house you speak of, it's not just haunted. It's a gateway. You've been marked." "Marked?" My voice trembled. "What does that mean?" It means they've chosen you. They're bound to you now, and they won't stop until you go back. I felt the air leave my lungs. Go back? To that house? No, I'll die if I go back. Father O'Brien's gaze was unwavering. If you don't face them, they'll claim you anyway. But there's a chance, a small one, that you can break their hold. You must confront them, make them let you go. The idea terrified me, but I was out of options. My life wasn't my own anymore. That night, armed with holy water, a Bible, and a growing sense of dread, I drove back to the cursed house. The drive felt endless. The streets were deserted, as if the world itself was warning me to turn back. When I arrived, the house stood exactly as I remembered, dark, decayed, and exuding an almost tangible malevolence. I stepped out of the car, clutching the Bible tightly. The air was heavy, oppressive, and the wind carried faint echoes of laughter. As I approached the front door, it creaked open on its own, inviting me inside. The dining room was just as I had left it. The table was set, the pizza box still in its place, and the 3 empty chairs waiting. But now, there were figures in the chairs. The little girl, the hulking man, and a woman whose face was obscured by shadows. "You came back," the little girl said, her voice sweet and chilling. "Now you can stay with us forever." I stepped forward, trembling, and raised the holy water. "I'm not staying," I said, my voice shaking. "In the name of God, I command you to release me." The room seemed to shudder. The figures laughed, a sound that was both human and inhuman. The shadows around them thickened, swirling like a storm. "You don't understand," the woman said, her voice deep and echoing. "You were ours the moment you stepped through that door. There's no escape." I recited prayers, sprinkling holy water around the room. The figures screamed, their forms flickering, but they didn't disappear. The house groaned, as if alive, and the walls began to close in. Desperate, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the final item Father O'Brien had given me, a crucifix blessed in a sacred rite. I held it high, shouting, "I renounce you. I reclaim my soul in the name of Christ." A deafening roar filled the room. The figures writhed, their forms dissolving into darkness. The house trembled violently, and for a moment, I thought it would collapse. Then, everything went still. When I opened my eyes, I was outside. The house was gone, replaced by an empty lot overgrown with weeds. My car was parked nearby, and the sun was rising on the horizon. I felt a strange sense of peace, but also a lingering fear. The house was gone, but the memories remained. I don't know if I truly escaped, or if they're still watching, waiting for the right moment to return. All I know is I'll never deliver another pizza again. The haunted forest of Blackwood. In a small, quiet town nestled in the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains, there was an ancient forest known as Blackwood. Locals whispered tales of strange happenings in the woods, disembodied voices, flickering shadows, and the unshakable feeling of being watched. Despite the warnings, the forest held an almost magnetic pull for the curious and adventurous. One evening, a group of college friends, Emma, Jake, Sarah, and Liam, decided to explore Blackwood. It was Jake's idea, of course. He had a knack for chasing thrills. "It's just an old legend," he scoffed, holding a flashlight like a sword. "What's the worst that could happen?" They entered the forest as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of deep purple and orange. The trees loomed over them, their twisted branches resembling skeletal fingers. The group laughed nervously, their voices quickly swallowed by the oppressive silence. An hour into their hike, they stumbled upon an abandoned cabin. Its wooden walls were weathered and split, and a rusty sign nailed to the door read, "Do not enter." Emma shivered. "This feels wrong," she whispered. Jake, ever the daredevil, pushed the door open with a grin. "Come on. Where's your sense of adventure?" The cabin was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of decay. Dust-covered furniture was scattered haphazardly, and strange symbols were carved into the walls. "These look like runes," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I think we should leave." But as they turned to exit, The door slammed shut. The flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. A faint, guttural laugh echoed through the cabin, followed by whispers that seemed to come from every direction. "Who's there?" Liam shouted, his voice cracking. The only response was the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, and circling them. Emma clutched Sarah's arm. "This isn't a joke, is it, Jake?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "It's not me," Jake replied, his bravado crumbling. Suddenly, the whispers turned into a deafening roar. The walls of the cabin began to bleed a thick, black liquid, and the carved symbols glowed a sickly green. A figure emerged from the shadows. A tall, gaunt woman with hollow eyes and a mouth that stretched impossibly wide. Her skeletal hands reached for them, her voice a haunting whisper. "You shouldn't have come." The group bolted for the door, yanking it open and sprinting into the forest. But the forest had changed. The path they had followed was gone, replaced by a maze of trees that seemed to move and shift. Emma tripped and fell, scraping her knees on the rough ground. When she looked up, she saw the woman's face inches from hers, her grin filled with jagged teeth. "Stay," the woman hissed. Jake grabbed Emma's arm and pulled her to her feet. "Run," he screamed. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs felt like lead. Finally, they broke through the tree-line and stumbled onto the highway. When they turned back, the forest was gone, replaced by an endless field of grass. Shaking and gasping for breath, the group vowed never to speak of that night again. But Emma couldn't escape the whispers. Every night, as she lay in bed, she heard them, soft and insistent. And sometimes, in the corner of her room, she saw the shadow of a woman with hollow eyes and a grin that stretched too wide. As weeks passed, Emma tried to forget the horrors of Blackwood, but the nightmares only grew worse. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back in that cabin, staring into the dark, hollow eyes of the woman. The sound of the whispers, soft, sinister, still echoed in her mind. She could feel them creeping up on her, crawling under her skin like insects. One night, while she was alone in her apartment, the doorbell rang. It was late, almost midnight, and Emma felt a chill run down her spine as she peeked through the peephole. No one stood outside, but the shadows around the doorway seemed to shift, almost like something was moving just out of sight. Her heart raced, but she opened the door, only to find nothing but the faintest trace of a footprint in the dust. It was large, far too large for any human. She slammed the door shut and locked it, but the unease remained. The next day, Emma's phone rang. It was Sarah, her voice frantic. "Emma, something's wrong. I've been hearing the whispers too. And I saw her again. The woman. She was standing outside my window last night, her face pressed against the glass." Emma's blood ran cold. "No, Sarah, you have to stay away from the forest. It's not over." But Sarah was already gone, her curiosity outweighing her fear. She had to find out what was happening, to understand why they were being tormented. The calls between Emma and Sarah became more frantic. Sarah described how the woman would appear in her dreams, always closer, her grin widening with every passing night. "She's coming for us, Emma," Sarah whispered during one call, her voice quivering. "But I don't know how to stop her." The more Sarah tried to escape the woman's grasp, the more the woman began to follow her, appearing in the reflection of mirrors, in the shadows of her house, and even in the faces of strangers on the street. It was as if the woman was now tied to them, bound to their very existence. Emma's phone went silent for a few days. She tried calling Sarah repeatedly, but there was no answer. Panic gnawed at Emma, and she felt an overwhelming urge to go back to the forest, to confront whatever dark force had haunted them. With trembling hands, she gathered the group again. Jake and Liam, who had stayed silent and distant since that fateful night in Blackwood. They all knew they had to face the darkness together, or they would never be free. As they approached the edge of the forest once more, the air grew thick, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. The ground seemed to pulse beneath their feet, and the familiar, twisted branches loomed ahead like skeletal fingers ready to drag them into the unknown. When they reached the cabin again, it was even more grotesque than before. The doors creaked open without a sound, and the walls bled with the same black liquid, now thicker, more viscous. They stepped inside, their flashlights barely cutting through the darkness. And then, they heard it, the whispers low and chilling. "You shouldn't have come back." The woman's silhouette emerged from the far corner, her tall form casting a shadow that seemed to stretch across the entire room. Her grin widened impossibly large, as her eyes glowed a sickly yellow. "You wanted to understand," she whispered, her voice a horrible mix of sadness and malice. "But now you will join me." Suddenly, the air grew icy, and the ground beneath their feet gave way. The room seemed to tilt as the forest around them warped and shifted, becoming a labyrinth of shadows. They were trapped, unable to find their way back. Emma screamed, trying to break free from the suffocating darkness. But just as the woman reached out to claim her, the sound of a gunshot echoed through the forest, followed by another. Liam had pulled out a revolver, firing at the figure in desperation. To their horror, the bullets passed through the woman's body as if she were made of smoke, her form flickering and distorting with each shot. Then, she let out a horrific scream, a sound that shook the very earth beneath them. The air grew heavy with an overwhelming presence as the forest seemed to close in around them. "Leave now," the woman shrieked, her voice cracking and twisting in unnatural ways. "You cannot escape me." The forest itself seemed to fight against them, its branches reaching for them like claws. But then, through the chaos, the clearing ahead came into view, dim light shining from the outside world. They ran, not looking back, their breaths ragged with fear. When they finally broke free from the trees and collapsed on the ground, gasping for air, they could hear the distant, faint whispers following them, never stopping, never quieting. Emma looked at her friends, her eyes wild with terror. "It's not over. She'll never let us go." They left Blackwood that night, never to return. But the whispers followed them, growing louder, never fading. And even though they tried to bury the memory of the woman and the forest deep in their minds, it would always haunt them, lurking just behind the veil of sleep, ready to claim them once more. The cursed woods of Blackwood still stood, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to wander in. In the quiet town of Shadow Creek, Massachusetts, a chilling tale unfolded. Ethan, a young man, was forced into an arranged marriage by his mother, Emily. The bride, Clara, was veiled, and her face was hidden from everyone. Ethan was furious, but his mother insisted that the marriage was a promise made by their fathers long ago. "Mom, you didn't even ask me before deciding my marriage," Ethan shouted, slamming his bedroom door. He paced around, his anger boiling over. He picked up his phone and dialed a number, his voice trembling with rage. "I can't believe she did this to me," he muttered into the phone. The next day, the guests arrived, but Clara remained veiled. Emily, curious and concerned, asked, "Why is your face covered, dear? Show us your beautiful face." Clara's father-in-law interjected, "She's a bit shy. She doesn't know you all yet. Everything will be fine after the wedding." Emily, though skeptical, agreed to the marriage. That night, Ethan stormed into his mother's room. "Mom, look at her. Her face is covered in scars. She's hideous." Emily rushed to Clara's room and saw the scars. "What is this? Why didn't you tell us?" she demanded. Clara, tears streaming down her face, explained, "I wanted to, but my family wouldn't let me. It's not permanent. I'm undergoing treatment. Please give me a chance." Emily's heart melted, but Ethan remained furious. Days later, Emily pleaded with him, "Son, she's kind and beautiful inside. Give her a chance." Ethan reluctantly agreed to take Clara out for a walk in the nearby mountains. As they hiked, Ethan received a phone call and walked ahead, leaving Clara behind. She struggled to keep up but found a shiny piece of glass on the ground. Intrigued, she picked it up and saw a reflection that wasn't hers. The glass seemed to ripple like water, and the reflection changed eerily. Clara caught up with Ethan, who was with another woman named Sarah. They pushed Clara off the cliff, staging it as an accident. As they celebrated their success, they returned to the car, only to find Clara sitting in the passenger seat, her face twisted in a grotesque smile. Ethan drove home in terror, but every time he looked in the rearview mirror, Clara's face morphed into something monstrous. That night, Ethan's bed shook violently. He turned to see Clara, but she was nowhere to be found. Instead, the glass from the mountain was there, and a terrifying figure emerged from it, laughing maniacally. The figure grabbed Ethan, and his body erupted in boils and sores, blood oozing from every pore. The figure cackled, "Now you will be as beautiful as I am. Forever." Meanwhile, a lone traveler named Jake encountered an old man on a desolate road. The old man warned Jake not to stop for anyone or anything until he reached his destination. Jake dismissed the warning, but as he continued, he encountered a car with blinding headlights. When he approached the car, he found it empty. Suddenly, a disfigured man appeared, his mouth mangled and his stomach ripped open. Jake fled in terror, seeking refuge in an abandoned house. As Jake hid, he heard knocking and a chilling voice. He mustered the courage to look outside and saw the disfigured man. Jake managed to escape and found his way back to the road, where a crowd had gathered. An ambulance was taking away a body, and the old man from earlier was there, lamenting that the road had claimed another life. Jake looked at the body and saw his own face, twisted in horror. From that day forward, Jake became a legend in Shadow Creek, a ghostly figure haunting the highway, seeking revenge on those who dared to travel the road at night. The mirror's curse lived on, claiming more souls and spreading terror throughout the town. It was already dark, and Jack Mallory, around 50 years old, was cooking dinner in his small cabin by the river. Just then, someone knocked on the door. Jack was startled and muttered to himself, "Who could it be at this hour?" The area was desolate, so it felt odd to have a visitor at this time. The knocking continued, and Jack called out, "Who's there? Hold on, I'll open it." He grabbed the lantern and walked to the door, opening it to find an old friend, Mike, standing there. Jack, surprised, said, "Mike, it's been so long. What brings you here? Come in, come in." Mike, about 35 years old, was soaked from the rain and wearing ragged clothes, looking quite strange. But in the dim light of the lantern, Jack's old eyes couldn't see him clearly. If he had been able to, he would have recognized that this wasn't the Mike he used to know, the one who would go fishing with him. Mike had moved to the city a few years ago and hadn't been seen since. Jack invited Mike inside and began to inquire about his well-being, but Mike didn't respond to any of his questions. It was as if he couldn't hear him at all. Finally, Jack, a bit frustrated, asked, "What's wrong with you, Mike? Ever since you arrived, you've been staring at the stove. Are you hungry? Do you want food?" Mike nodded in response. Jack went to the stove to serve him food. As Jack was about to give him the fish curry, Mike suddenly pulled the pot towards himself. Jack, annoyed, said, "What are you doing, Mike? That curry is piping hot, and you want to eat it all." Before Jack could finish speaking, Mike's face twisted in anger. His face changed so drastically that Jack felt a chill run down his spine. Terrified, Jack stammered, "You're not Mike. Are you? Who are you?" Before Jack could react, Mike threw the scalding pot of curry onto him. Jack screamed in agony as the hot sauce burned his skin. He fell to the ground, writhing in pain. Mike, moving with the speed of lightning, pounced on him. With sharp, jagged teeth, he tore into Jack's chest, ripping his heart out in one swift motion. Jack's scream echoed through the quiet riverside, but it was too late. The next day, Jack's lifeless body lay in his cabin, and the villagers who came to see it had already gone. However, Jack's 26-year-old daughter, Emily, still sat by his body, crying. She wondered who could have murdered her father so cruelly. Just as she pondered this, the door to the cabin creaked open. An elderly man walked in, dressed like a mystic. Upon seeing Jack's state, he looked at Emily and said, "Guru Tanaka, I am a mystic. I am deeply saddened by what happened to your father. He and I were close, and I know who did this to him." Emily, crying, asked, "Who did this to my father? If I find out, I will make them pay." Guru Tanaka gently replied, "The time for your father's last rites will come soon. Please wait and I will tell you everything." That evening, as the fire consumed Jack's body, Emily stood in front of the flames, her eyes burning with vengeance. Suddenly, she heard a voice from behind. She turned around to find Guru Tanaka approaching. "Emily, I told you I know who did this. You deserve to know," he said cryptically. Emily, desperate for answers, responded, "Who was it? Guru? Who took my father's life?" Guru Tanaka led Emily through the dense forest toward a secluded cabin. There, by the fire, he revealed the terrifying truth. What killed your father was not a man, nor an animal, but a river spirit. It's called the bog, an ancient creature that lives in rivers. It comes from the waters of the Tennessee River. The bog is a shapeshifter, a creature that can take the form of anyone it chooses, blending in with the townsfolk. It preys on the fishermen in the area, always hungry, always seeking to feast. Emily, horrified, asked, "But how can we stop it, Guru? Surely there's a way to defeat it." Guru Tanaka looked grave. "Yes, there is. The bog carries a small pouch tied to its shoulder. Its power lies in that pouch. If you manage to seize it, the bog will lose its strength and die. The magic contained in that pouch will pass into whoever holds it." Emily's eyes widened as she processed the information. She thanked the mystic and was about to leave, but Guru Tanaka's intentions took a dark turn. He grabbed her hand tightly, smiling eerily. "Do you think I gave you this knowledge out of kindness? No, Emily. You'll have to pay for it. You will satisfy my desires before you leave." Emily screamed as the mystic pulled her closer, but no one could hear her cries in the forest. She was helpless against his twisted intentions. After a few moments, she fled from the cabin, disheveled and broken, running toward her father's cabin in the rain. She crouched in the corner, crying, trembling from both the rain and the horror she had just endured. Then, a knock echoed at the door. Emily froze. She hesitated for a moment before going to the door. She glanced in the mirror, making herself presentable before opening it. On the other side stood Mike, or rather, the creature wearing his face. It spoke in a strange, guttural voice. "I'm hungry. I need food. You have plenty here." "Don't worry, Mike," Emily said with a twisted smile. "I'll make sure your hunger is satisfied." Mike, the river demon, entered eagerly. He sat down on the floor, waiting for food. Emily set the pot of fish curry in front of him, and he devoured it like a beast. As he ate, Emily noticed a small pouch hanging from his shoulder. She quickly grabbed a burning piece of wood from the stove and, with precision, struck the demon across the face. Mike howled in pain and transformed into his true monstrous form, claws slashing at Emily. But Emily, with a surge of strength, grabbed the pouch from his shoulder, and as she did, the demon's power faded. The firewood she had struck him with consumed the creature's body, and the bog burned to death. That night, as Guru Tanaka slept in his cabin, a knock came at his door. He opened it to find Emily standing there, a bloodied figure with a wicked smile. Her hands and face were covered in the blood of Tanaka's severed body, and she carried the bog's pouch on her shoulder. Emily laughed, her voice a chilling echo in the night. "Vengeance is sweet, isn't it, Guru?" And with that, Emily vanished into the forest, her revenge complete. Next story is about a truck driver. My name is Jack Thomas, and I'm a truck driver. I've been driving for years, crisscrossing the country, delivering all sorts of goods. But the story I'm about to share is one of the strangest and most unsettling things that ever happened to me. It's a story that still makes my skin crawl whenever I think back to it. So, sit tight and brace yourself because this isn't your average trucker tale. It all started in 1975 when I was just 20 years old. I had just earned my trucker's license and was ready to hit the open road. My dad, a military veteran, had a truck, and the government gave him a bit of money after his service. With that, he bought a big rig, and soon after, I took over the wheel. Back then, it was tough to get a foothold, but I made my way by taking small jobs in between bigger contracts. One of those contracts took me to a mountain range near a small town in California, where a new road was being built to connect the town to the rest of the state. They were using gravel and sand for the construction, and I was hauling it back and forth. The work wasn't hard, but the nights were something else. Since I lived far from the site, I would often park my truck by the side of the road and sleep in it. The area was remote, surrounded by dense forest, and it was mostly quiet except for the sounds of the night and the occasional passing vehicle. There were a few workers on site, but they all lived nearby, so by nightfall it was just me. Sometimes, I'd step out of the truck to stretch my legs and get some air, but it was a lonely place. With the road under construction, it was often dark, and there was no light except for the one I kept in the truck. It was one of those nights, around midnight, when I was jolted awake by a knock on the door of my truck. I groggily rubbed my eyes and reached for the flashlight by the bed. I shone it outside and saw a figure standing in the dim light. The man was tall, with a scruffy beard and worn-out clothes, his eyes squinting from the flashlight's beam. I wasn't in the mood for company, but I rolled the window down just enough to hear him. "Hey, buddy, you got any water?" he asked, his voice hoarse, as if he'd been walking for hours. "I've been out here for a while, and I'm dying of thirst." I took a moment to size him up, but I could see no reason not to help him out. "Sure, hold on," I said, grabbing a bottle of water from the cooler I kept inside the truck. I passed it through the window, and he took it gratefully, drinking like he hadn't had anything to drink in days. After he finished, he handed the bottle back, wiping his mouth. "Thanks, man. I've been walking from that place down the road. You know, the diner? Martha's Diner? Great food. But that spicy chili, phew, really messed with my stomach. But I'm all right now. Just need to rest." I had never heard of Martha's Diner. I'd been working in the area for a while, and there was no sign of any diner anywhere. "Where exactly is it?" I asked, intrigued. "It's about 20 minutes down the road," he said, pointing in the direction he had come from. "Little shack, really. You wouldn't even know it's a diner if you didn't look closely. But man, the food is fantastic. You should check it out if you're ever hungry." I nodded, still skeptical. "I'll keep that in mind," I said, and the man gave me a crooked grin before disappearing back into the dark woods. I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep easily after that. My curiosity was piqued. A diner in the middle of nowhere? It seemed odd, but I decided to check it out the next evening. I figured I could use a hot meal, and it would give me something to do. The next day, I worked hard hauling gravel and sand for the construction crew. When the sun began to set, I took a break, grabbing a quick meal from my truck, and then headed out on foot to find this mysterious diner. The forest around here wasn't dangerous. There weren't any wild animals to worry about. At least that's what I thought at the time. I walked for about 30 minutes, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. Rustling leaves, the occasional chirp of a bird. The road wasn't paved, so it was a bit hard to navigate, but eventually, I began to smell something. It was faint at first, but as I followed the scent, it grew stronger: spices, roasting meat, and fresh bread. My stomach growled, and I quickened my pace. And then, out of nowhere, there it was. A small shack with a flickering red lantern hanging above the door. The sign read, "Martha's Diner," in faded letters, just as the man had said. It looked so out of place in the middle of nowhere, like it had been dropped there from another time. I walked up and knocked on the door, but no one answered. I knocked again, louder this time, and just as I was about to give up, I heard footsteps from behind me. Turning around, I saw a woman standing there. She was older, maybe in her late 60s, with graying hair pulled back into a messy bun. She wore a white apron stained with something dark. Maybe food, maybe something else. "Can I help you, dear?" she asked, her voice warm but raspy. I asked her about the diner, and she invited me in, saying she had a fresh meal ready. The place smelled amazing, and I could hear the sizzling of food from the back. I took a seat at the small wooden table near the window, the warm light from the lantern flickering on the walls. The old woman, who introduced herself as Martha, brought me a plate of food, a simple dish of flatbread, rice, and some sort of stew with vegetables. It was basic but comforting. As I dug in, I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. There was something about the place, something off, but my hunger won out and I ate the meal. After finishing, I tried to pay her, but she refused, saying, "Come back tomorrow, and I'll make something special for you." No need for payment. I thanked her, though I was a bit confused. Who wouldn't want to be paid for their food? But she smiled and assured me it was no trouble. The next night, I returned, excited for the special meal she had promised. This time, when I arrived, she was already waiting for me. She greeted me with a smile, though it seemed a little too wide, too forced. But I brushed it off and went inside. She set a plate in front of me, roti, rice, a salad, and a large portion of meat. The meat was dark and rich-looking, and the aroma was mouth-watering. My stomach growled as I dug in. But the moment I tasted the meat, something didn't feel right. It had a strange, metallic taste to it. It wasn't unpleasant, but it definitely wasn't like anything I'd had before. I finished the meal, feeling strangely full but oddly uncomfortable. I asked her again if I could pay, and she laughed. "No need, son. Just come back tomorrow, and I'll make something even better." I didn't want to seem rude, so I left without pushing the issue. As I walked back to my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The forest seemed quieter, the night darker. I had a strange sense of being watched, but when I turned around, nothing was there. That night, as I lay in my truck, the thought of Martha's diner kept swirling in my mind. I decided I'd go back the next day to ask her more questions. Maybe it was just a weird, isolated place, but I needed answers. I didn't know what exactly, but I needed something. So, I set out the next evening to find her once again. But when I arrived at the diner, it was gone. The shack, the lantern, everything. It had vanished without a trace. The road was empty, and there was nothing where the diner should have been. It was as though it had never existed. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty patch of dirt, trying to make sense of what had happened. Maybe I was just tired, hallucinating, or maybe, just maybe, I had stumbled upon something far darker than I could comprehend. I never saw that woman again, never found the diner, and never got the answers I was looking for. But I still remember the taste of that meat. And every time I pass through that part of California, I can't help but feel a chill run down my spine. The cursed doll. "Mommy, Mommy, listen to me." Little Ethan tried climbing onto his mother Emily's lap. Emily gently picked him up, saying, "Just a little longer, sweetheart. Let me finish designing this last toy, and then we'll talk as much as you want." Emily was the lead designer at a renowned toy manufacturing company. Due to the COVID-19 lockdown, she was working from home. Apart from Emily and Ethan, their household usually included a nanny. However, the lockdown had stranded the nanny in her hometown. Ethan, a bubbly and talkative 6-year-old, was brimming with energy. Earlier, his nanny would enthusiastically listen to his stories, but with her gone, and Emily occupied with work, Ethan had grown lonely. As soon as Emily closed her laptop for the day, Ethan chirped, "Mommy, can you make me a talking doll? Then I won't bother you." I'll just talk to it instead." His innocent request made Emily laugh. She thought for a moment, then walked to the storage room. A week ago, some prototypes of toys Emily had designed were sent to her home for review. Due to the sudden office closure, they had remained at her house. Emily picked up one of the dolls and handed it to Ethan. It was a beautiful doll, but its slightly misaligned eyes gave it an unsettling appearance. Ethan's face lit up. "Wow, Mommy, you're amazing. You got me this lovely doll so quickly. I'll talk to her all the time now." Hugging the doll, Ethan rushed to his room, while Emily went to prepare dinner. During dinner, Emily noticed something unusual. Ethan not only ate quickly but also reached over to take food from her plate. Slightly surprised, she chalked it up to his excitement and hunger from playing. After dinner, Emily resumed her work while Ethan immersed himself in playing with his new doll. Minutes later, Emily was startled by Ethan's laughter. It sounded strange, almost unnatural. She rushed to his room and found him sitting on top of the bookshelf, clutching the doll. Alarmed, she asked, "Ethan, how did you get up there? You could have fallen. How would I have taken you to the hospital during this lockdown? What if we caught an infection?" Ethan giggled. "Relax, Mommy. My doll told me to sit here and play. She even held my hand to help me climb." Emily, accustomed to Ethan's vivid imagination, dismissed his words and carefully helped him down. "No more playing in your room alone. Stay where I can see you," she instructed, relieved to have him nearby as she returned to work. A series of strange events. Over the next few days, odd occurrences became routine. Ethan's appetite seemed insatiable. He laughed in eerie tones, and he began climbing to high places effortlessly. His face occasionally took on a strange expression that unsettled Emily. Each time, Ethan claimed the doll had told him what to do. Emily dismissed it as childish fantasy and blamed her growing anxiety on overwork. Deciding she needed a break, Emily planned to request leave the next day. That evening, she called Ethan for dinner. "I'm not hungry, Mommy," he replied from his room. "Why not?" "Stop being stubborn," Emily said, entering his room. Ethan's response sent chills down her spine. "My doll told me not to eat. If I stop eating, I'll slowly die and become a doll like her. Then I'll always stay in her world." Shocked and angry, Emily raised her hand to scold him, but froze midair. She couldn't move her hand. Her eyes darted to Ethan. His eyes glowed a menacing red, and the doll in his hands emitted a chilling laugh. Both spoke in unison, "You can't touch us. You can't stop us. Leave us alone." Terrified, Emily fled to her room. Trembling and drenched in sweat, she tried to rationalize what had happened. After composing herself, she crept back to Ethan's room. He was asleep, the doll still beside him. Gathering her courage, Emily grabbed the doll, took it outside, and smashed it into pieces. She packed the remnants in a box and stored it with other damaged toys slated for reconstruction. Relieved, she whispered, "Finally, we're free from this cursed doll." But as Emily returned to Ethan's room, a blood-curdling scream escaped her lips. On the bed lay the same doll, smiling eerily, while Ethan had transformed into a lifeless doll himself. The doll's voice echoed, "Did you think you could destroy me? I am a curse that can never be erased. I needed a companion, and I found one. Your Ethan is mine now." Emily's knees buckled, and she collapsed unconscious. In her delirium, she muttered, "Leave my Ethan alone. Don't turn him into a doll. Please spare him." The haunting truth. She woke to the sensation of water splashing on her face. Opening her eyes, she saw Ethan holding a jug of water, concern etched on his face. "Mommy, are you okay? You wouldn't wake up and you were saying strange things. I called the nanny, and she told me to pour water on you." Overwhelmed, Emily hugged Ethan tightly. "It was just a bad dream, sweetheart. Mommy's fine now." After calming down, she asked Ethan about the doll. "I don't know where it is, Mommy. "I've been looking for it," Ethan replied innocently. Heart pounding, Emily hurried to the storage room. She opened the box and found the shattered doll pieces intact. Relieved, she set them on fire and watched as the pieces burned to ash. Convinced she had ended the nightmare, she returned to Ethan's room. But what she saw froze her in place. The doll sat on Ethan's bed, smiling sinisterly. It spoke in a chilling tone. "I told you, I'm a curse that can never be destroyed." Emily's blood ran cold as realization dawned. She sprinted back to the storage room and screamed in horror. Among the charred remains were not the doll's pieces, but Ethan's tiny, burnt hands. To this day, Emily's wails echo through the halls of the psychiatric hospital. "I didn't kill my Ethan. I killed the cursed doll. I swear I killed the doll."